Hey, what's going on, guys? We got an exciting one today. I'm going to be cutting this Moldavite. Now, Moldavite is what some refer to as space glass. Basically, what happens is a meteorite strikes the Earth, and the sand is actually transferred with heat and impact into this piece of glass. Now, without light behind it, it's pretty dark. It's got a pretty dark rind on it. And as you can see here, internally, it's actually a pretty nice green. Now, the Moldavite, to my understanding, comes in a couple different colors. It's almost green all the time. Maybe it's called a different name, but sometimes it comes out a little bit of a yellow color when it's in Egypt. So I was asked to cut a yin-yang cut on this piece. Now, this piece is 12.4 carats, 12.4 grams, and the owner of this piece actually wanted to get the largest yield we can get. Now, the design we're going to be cutting actually has quite a deep pavilion. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be altering the pavilion, which is going to take away a little bit from the light return, potentially cause some windowing, but we are going to be able to yield a much larger stone. Now, just starting off here, this is actually a 60 grit that's been pretty worn in, probably cutting like 100 grit. And I'm just using this to preform the perimeter, try and get the circular shape we're going to be going for, and remove some of this rind from the stone itself. Now, this is my first time actually cutting Moldavite, and Moldavite is essentially just glass. So I've cut quite a bit of glass before, and I'm pretty familiar with how it cuts. Now, when I first started learning faceting, glass was actually the starting material that I started working with, so I'm extremely familiar with how this cuts, and it cuts pretty nice. Almost cuts like butter, actually, so it's a pretty impressive material to learn and cut on, and it's just very user friendly. Okay, so going to be using my UV glue for this one, and I have an extremely beefy dop stick. I've never actually even used this dop before. Now, this Moldavite is something like 26 millimeters, maybe even 30 millimeters wide, which is pretty significant. And this is going to cut hopefully around a 20 millimeter wide stone when I'm finished. Now that I got it on the dop stick, I'm going to go back and properly cut in the girdle here. And this is, again, just kind of a bit of a preforming. We are going to be starting off with the intense grit to make sure that we get the fastest cut on the stone, just to get things shaped in, because there's so much material to remove. Now, depending upon what stone I'm cutting, I would actually be typically using a 360 grit for this stage. Now, when you use a very aggressive grit lap, there is the chance of it knocking your stone off of the dop. Now, I used such a significant amount of glue, and I'm actually using my finger to push down, and that is going to help alleviate some of the stress on the bond of glue to dop, where if I were to press on the mast, you'd have the chance of actually knocking your stone off. You'd have a higher chance of that happening. Okay, so I am now transferred to my 360 grit, and I've cut in the first row of facets on the pavilion. There's actually only one row on this pavilion, which is not typical on gem designs. Now, this is just the way this design is created. It has 144 cuts, and the pavilion is pretty basic because majority of the work is going to be done on the crown. And that's what's going to give us this fun yin-yang shape that was requested for me to cut. So working away here on the 360, this is just mainly to remove the deep surface scratches from that, we'll call it a 100 grit lap. And this is going to get me set up for my 1200 sintered. And after my 1200 sintered, I'm able to go right to a polishing lap. So that is the culet formed. There's the pavilion with the 360 grit. And you can see it's pretty scratched up, but that is significantly better than the way the stone was left after the 100 grit. Okay, so I have my sintered lap on the wheel on the machine now, and I'm showing the first 4 cuts there. As you can see, I'm just removing a majority of the frostiness and the cutting from the frostiness and the scratches from the cutting of the 100 grit. Now, this is my favorite lap that I own. It's very precise in terms of it's a very calibrated, flat, even lap. It cuts extremely uniform, and it actually leaves the finish of a 3000 grit. So when you're using a sintered, they usually leave the finish of the lap that's the next stage up. So a 600 sintered is going to cut like a 1200 electroplated, and a 1200 sintered is going to cut like a 3000 electroplated in terms of the finish. Now, I had another buddy over. He's working on something on my other bench in the background there. We're just discussing another project that we're working on, and I'm also trying to cut my Moldavite, so there's a bit going on in that scene. Okay, so that's the 1200 finish on the Pavilion now. As you can see, it's looking pretty good. Things are pretty crisp, and we are now set up and ready for the polishing stage that we're going to be doing on this Pavilion. Now, when it comes down to it, there's different polishes that I use, and there's different lap sequences I use dependent upon the material. Now, because this is glass, I'm able to hop right from the 1200 grit right to my polish, where if this was a sapphire, for example, I would have to throw another lap in between. I'm going to polish on a 50,000 grit, but I would have to throw in an 8,000, and that's just because the material is so... It's a 9 on the Mohs. It's a very hard material. Okay, so I've hopped over, and we are going to use my copper lap on this one. Now, these facets, they're actually going to take a little longer to polish than typical. The reason is they are so large. Now, when you're working on a piece of material of this size, the entire cutting process is just going to take longer because there's that much more material. It's very basic. Now, when it comes to the polishing phase of all this, for me to remove these scratches in the 1200 grit and to leave a proper polish, I just have to spend a little more time, potentially do some tweaking with the cheater and the height adjustment to make sure that I'm actually going to hit every area of the facet. Now, the table facet on the typical stone that I'm cutting is smaller than each individual facet on this Pavilion, and the table facet is usually the longest facet for polishing. So for me to do, I forget what the number was on the base of this thing, something like 60 facets, maybe 90. It took a little bit of time to get that in. Now, I actually polished it once, went back, polished it all a second time. Now here I am throwing the gem into the transfer jig. We're going to, again, I'm going to use my UV glue here, and we are going to get this thing properly secured. Now what I'm doing is I'm adding the glue in stages and UV curing it because there's such a significant amount of glue that needs to be cured. And typically I would use my super glue for the amount of glue that I needed to secure this thing and actually do an adequate gem transfer. I probably would have had to use a quarter of, it's only 15 milliliters in a bottle. I probably used about 5 milliliters, if I were to guess, maybe only 3 in glue there. So that is a significant amount of glue that would have taken a long time to dry. And if I'm typically waiting 24 hours for something to dry, and I'm going to do 10 times the amount of glue, I didn't want to wait that long. I wanted to keep going, so I used the UV glue in stages. Okay, so I'm back to my 100 grit here, and this is just to cut the main first row of the crown, get down close, and get near the finished shape of my girdle. And I typically would not be using this lap on a crown. The only reason I'm doing this is due to the sheer volume of gem that I'm trying to remove. So again, this is going to leave a pretty scratched surface. Things aren't very even or equal. And that's not really the point of that lap. It's just to get the material removed. Now I've hopped to my 360 grit here, and I'm going to be, again, getting closer to the girdle. Now, when it comes to the size of your girdle, it typically is going to be a ratio of thickness of girdle to size of stone. So I'm going to do a relatively large girdle on this, maybe 1/2 millimeter thick, which is pretty extreme, but comparative to the size of the stone, it's not really that extreme at all. So I have maybe 1 millimeter left, and I'm going to be working that closer, so when I get my final stage before my polishing, which is going to be my 1200 grit, I'm going to be able to properly hone things in with that lap at that stage. So just flying through with the 360 here, it's cutting quickly, it's helping remove the bulk of the scratches from the 100 grit, and we're getting ourselves ready to transfer to my 1200. So you can see some of the pattern being cut in now, and I typically don't do this with a 360 grit because it's not going to be accurate enough. It's going to cut too much material at a time, but again, just for the size of this stone, I decided in this situation it's going to do the job. Now here's our first shot at the yin-yang actually kind of coming into shape here. Pretty scratched up, pretty rough, but that is going to be the actual finished pattern that you're visibly seeing there. So I decided to do a podcast style on this one because I actually broke the microphone in my camera somehow. I'm not fully sure what actually went wrong. So I don't typically do these podcast style, but maybe let me know in the comments below if you like this style. And I was having some requests from people to make longer formats, so I decided that I would make this video a little longer. People seem to enjoy the process of watching the stones being cut and like a little bit more of a longer format. So that's what I'm going to do. I think I'd have to agree with everybody. I was having issues at the start where the audience retention was very low, and it was suggesting that people wanted shorter content, so that's just something I'm trying to figure out as time goes on. So got my 1200 grit on, and we're going to be getting the shape cut in proper, make sure everything's crisp, and we're going to remove those surface scratches that we left from the 360 grit. And luckily enough, this stone was large enough to do this pattern. Now, to be able to fit so many facets onto a crown is pretty serious. So we got the first row done there, and we're going to slowly work on to the second row. Now, for me, I like all my meet points to land exactly where they need to be. As you can see, the second row, I'm pretty happy with how everything landed. It's the shape that the diagram suggests you want the stone to look like, and I'm hoping that the customer or the client is going to be happy with this, the way it's cutting as well. So just working away. It's going to take a little bit of time to get this done on the 1200 grit, which is why I pre-did all of the facets on the 360 grit, which I don't normally do. But again, this is quite the large piece. We're talking 12.5 or 12.7 grams, which is over 60 carats. Now, I'm hoping this is going to end up somewhere between the 15 to 25 carat range, as I have altered the angle on the pavilion. Now, I don't typically do that, but I do whatever I'm requested by the client, and this individual was concerned about the lack of yield. I had mentioned that it was probably going to yield about 15% of the original weight, as this piece started off kind of pancake shaped, and if I was going to do the actual pavilion angles that the diagram suggested, it was going to yield a very low amount because I would have to remove so much of that material to have enough height to actually have the Q-lit finish up how he was requesting it to finish. So went with what he wanted, and we are going to sacrifice a little bit of light return, but we are going to maximize the yield, and that just comes down to the preference of the owner, what they personally want done. So I got everything cut in now on the main 3 rows. Now, the main pattern in the center is what I'm going to be tackling next. So just starting out here on the first couple rows. So this part's going to take a little bit of time to make sure that we get this pattern to look exactly like it's going to look on the design. And I just took my time and made sure the meet points all landed where they needed to. And I'm thinking that's a pretty good representation of what this gem diagram was showing. And I'm happy with the finished result. I'm ready to transfer over now to my polishing lap. Here's a shot of it zoomed out a little bit. I need to get a better camera for the future. This camera does macro, which is super close, and it does zoomed out shots. So there's no real in between. So moving on to the polish now. And this took a long time, so I decided to just show you guys the shots as we progressed through each stage of facets. Now, there is oil all over the stone, and once I actually remove all that oil and the fingerprints, you're going to see this sparkle a lot nicer. Now, that is just the first 2 rows cut in there, and we're going to slowly work our way towards the yin-yang actual pattern in the center. So polishing out this yin-yang pattern on the top is going a lot smoother than the Pavilion was, and that just comes down to the size of these facets. There's so many crammed into this crown that the actual area of polish per facet is a lot less significant than it was on the Pavilion. Now, typically on the Pavilion, you break a Pavilion up into, at the minimum, 2 rows, where this one only had 1, which was a little interesting. But it still has 144 cuts, and they just decided to put all the cuts into the crown, so that's pretty unique. Now, just like that, we have this thing finally finished up. Okay, so that's the finished Moldavite. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed these longer format podcast style videos. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys on the next episode.